Hi everyone, Alon here from Panda. We're here with another episode from Pressure Point, and I'm really excited to have Palesa Ntoagae, who has an esteemed career across some of South Africa's leading financial services brands, both in the South African context and the global context. So really excited to have her here. We're chatting before, and I think she's really got lived experience from an HR perspective that is super valuable, and I'm excited to dig into the conversation and learn more from her. So Palesa, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Alon. Really excited to be contributing, to the fraternity. I'm really passionate about all matters of well-being where employees are concerned, and I consider myself the chief dealer of hope.
We love that, and I think, we've dealt with you in your previous role, and your passion for people was abundantly clear, and I think it's authentic, which is why you're in the industry that you're in.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a great place to start. I think we were chatting earlier, and you don't actually come from a traditional academic background from an HR perspective. So give us some context on your academic background and your professional career, and we'll go forward from there.
Yeah, excellent. So, as you mentioned, I'm currently the Human Capital Executive at Old Mutual Insure. I've spent a lot of time in the financial services industry in SA and across the continent. But what a lot of people don't realize is that I actually studied a BCom degree at Rhodes University many years ago. And the first job I landed, my line manager tasked me with a huge job of landing the company's first learnership program. Sure. And it was the first in the space. And I think, the experience after I saw just the impact, the real human impact of how the 10 lives of learners were changed just from securing employment, and the improvement in the quality of life of their families. I was stuck. I was like, I actually want to be in this. So I've chosen to stay, to contribute, to give back. And over the years, I've just continued studying business-related qualifications because I think that helps sharpen the X. But certainly remembering that my role in any organization is to keep the people agenda alive and say, what can we do to make sure that people, as the most important resources in any organization, are being looked after, and also just making sure that their skills certainly remain relevant for future prospects of the organization.
That's awesome. And I love Chief Dealer of Hope. I think, that's something that we should all aspire to do, like bring hope to the people we interact with, the organizations we work for.
Yep.
So I love that. I think something that we've spoken about, and I know something that you're passionate about and something which is critical to creating hope in an organization, is having empathetic leaders. And I think it's a term that people use quite broadly, but no one really knows, how do you, build a culture of empathy within an organization? And I think it does start at the top. So maybe speak a bit about how you do that from your perspective.
Yeah. I think it's so important so leaders have a lot that's at stake. Often we are tasked with ensuring that whatever's been promised to the shareholders, is delivered along. And I think we can quickly get into a cycle of just focusing on the numbers. And I think something that's really useful for us to take stock of is, in building your muscle of being empathetic, you really have to want to care about the development and, I guess, where people are coming from. I'm not sure we spend enough time being inquisitive about, whether it be your direct reports or your team. What are the circumstances that are shaping this individual? Where does this person come from? What are their dreams and ambitions? Over and above the stuff that is contractually obligated to do. And I think if more and more people really had that sense of care, deeply caring and wanting the best for a Palesa, it's one way of us strengthening leadership, and this empathy, because to your point, it is a buzzword, but I think it only comes through in energy, in intentions. And I just think if more leaders actually genuinely cared and wanted to know about who I am, where do I come from, what are the struggles I face to get to work, what are some of the challenges, and if I'm attuned to that, that's how people feel you're an empathetic leader. If you're not, and it's superficial, then you're not going to get people to open up and be honest with you so that you really appreciate the backgrounds and environments that your employees are faced with on a day-to-day, and perhaps how you can respond differently, as a leader.
Yes. I mean, it's so simple when you put it that way, right? It's really about putting yourself in someone else's shoes and asking basic questions and actually caring about the answers that you're receiving, right? Not just paying lip service or asking questions because you're expected to.
Exactly.
So, I mean, I think, those are lessons that everyone can take and hopefully implement quite quickly. When it comes to growing leaders within an organization, I think, a challenge that I've seen that we hear from clients is that often the people who get promoted are the strong individual contributors, but they've never really had a leader team. So how do you equip people with that? I mean, how do you, create a behavior where those things become naturally and authentic in the way that they come to you?
I think as a fraternity, we have to be more vocal about what is the success profile of a leader and be honest about it. To your point, I think for many, many years, individual contributors have been catapulted into leadership positions that actually affects the individual and the team. And I think getting the balance between what skills are required for you to ascend as a leader, they are more behavioral, they're more soft. And as I mentioned, it really is about how vested are you in the development of others, because your output is the health state of your team. It's actually not the action or the task anymore. They are the ones that are responsible for the task. Yours is to care about them as whole human beings who contribute to the delivery of the plan. And I think there needs to be a bigger focus and investment into upskilling leaders on the soft, skills that, from my point of view, are certainly the new skills that actually matter, for anybody who has people that report into them. I just find the balance is not necessarily equal. I think we still value technical skill as opposed to, helping people to become different leaders. And I think what we saw over the last few years, with the onset of the pandemic, is a lot of companies driving promotions, in an endeavor to show that there's still growth opportunities, but not enough being paid into behaviorally, are these the people that can actually set a vision, inspire, and galvanize people around the same goal, while caring, for who they are. And that for me is still work that needs to happen. Some of the, implications and impacts we've seen, Alon, is really leaders struggling with proximity bias. We have so many people who actually aren't clear, what is the outcome I'm actually measuring? And so it's easier for me to assume that Alon is the one that's working because I see him every day. So that bias comes through. And I think our role is to help leaders really transition through this period. But ultimately, it is about making the right investment behaviorally in soft skills that are crucial, for somebody who's in a leadership position. How I respond to my team when they've made a mistake, when trying to deliver something that was really meaningful to the business, is very different, to how I respond when I assume there was ill intent. And it's a subtle shift and a subtle change. And I think more work needs to be done from that perspective.
Yeah, I love the point around assuming, what intent are you assuming? And I think the default for people is unfortunately to assume ill intent. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you go into a situation and you assume good intent, your whole framing of the situation will change, 180 degrees. And I think so much conflict, so much, breakdown in trust, breakdown in communication can be avoided if people just subtly change the way they approach these situations.
Correct. And, the higher calling for us to be able to self-regulate, right? One of the conversations I had with somebody I work with was, we carry so much of our own. So leaders are also human beings. And what happens is the moment you walk into a workplace, you are on a stage. And so that means a lot of the time having that ability to put your stuff in the back seat so that you're able to focus on the people that are waiting and looking to you for direction. So that ability to self-regulate, self-composed, Alon, is so important, because I could also be having a bad day. But in that split second of how I respond, I could really make someone else's week, month, or year, incredibly difficult because of that moment that they experienced me, because I was just simply having a bad day. So there's such a higher calling of servant leadership, and being able to put your own self-interests behind everybody else. And that's why I'm saying, this need to us being clear and open about what is the success profile of a leader. It really is somebody who cares deeply, about others way before their own, self-objectives.
Yeah. So just because you said care deeply, I think a concept which I love is this concept of radical candor, where it comes to feedback. And if you give feedback, you're giving the feedback because you care deeply about the person. And for the person receiving the feedback, they should receive it knowing that you care deeply.
Yeah.
And it goes back to your point in framing. If you frame that conversation with that lens, it changes the way that feedback's received, because the person knows it's coming from a place of good intent versus ill intent.
Correct. And consistency matters. And so, if you're somebody who changes, depending on who's in the room or who's watching, that also doesn't help, right? And being intentional about wanting the best for somebody else or being invested in their growth and development has to be experienced consistently, by the recipient. Else, all you're doing is you make people confused, you leave them in a confused state of mind, and it starts eroding the trust actually that they have. You touched on listening, earlier, Alon, and I want to branch out on it. There's nothing worse than a team member or somebody asking, "What's your daughter's name again?" And I think that for me, it's small moments that show if somebody actually is listening to me, if I'm being heard, and if they care. And it can be as small as me telling you my son is not okay on a Friday and you checking in on Monday. By the way, you said Jay wasn't well. How's he doing today? That shows people that you're listening. And that's how you start obtaining the trust. And people know that you really do care about me, who I am, and everything else in turn that I care about, without overreaching, or stepping above, certain boundaries. Because ultimately, goal conversations have to take place, performance review conversations have to take place. But I think there's a big difference getting feedback from somebody that cares about you versus somebody whose intentions you're actually not sure. Are they waiting to catch you doing something wrong, or are they actually there to coach you if you've done something wrong? And I think that for me, it's energy and intention that can't be misconstrued, can't be confused, and can be earned over time if you're consistent in how you show up to those that report to you.
Yeah, I think it's so important, just that consistency in investing in relationships and building that trust. You've touched on a lot of points. I think where I want to take the conversation is, some of the fine balancing act that leaders need to play within an organization. And you've touched on some of those difficult conversations, like, businesses ultimately need to deliver for shareholders.
Correct.
What we're seeing as a trend is teams are feeling under-resourced. So as a leader and as an empathetic leader, how do you ensure that you can drive, delivery, but also be cognizant of workload and, ensuring that there's fairness in what you're asking your people to deliver?
Ours is to really push back against that which is not practical or feasible. And I think there are too many people who are, in a take and pass on mode. I strongly believe, Alon, that, if between me and my principals, the expectations for the team that I have is too much, so the job jar is really spilling over. The responsibility I carry for my people is to negotiate, and be clear on what can be delivered, in one cycle versus another. Because to your point, part of the organizational issues that affect mental well-being for employees is workload. Excessive workload has been proven over time to contribute to burnout. An environment that is characterized by fixed deadlines, high pressure consistently, has an adverse impact on people's state of health. And, it's over and above human capital playing a role, but ultimately it is the leader. How are you negotiating for the workload that your team, is carrying. As I mentioned, your role is to care for your team. They will do the job, but yours is to care for them. And I think that's part and parcel of the line, that line managers have to fulfill, and the responsibility rather that line managers have to fulfill. That negotiating on deadlines, in addition to workload, because those are things that are easy for us to fix. They're easy to resolve. They are within our decision rights. And I think, if you're sitting there and you're taking stuff on because you're not going to do it, but it's going to affect your team, that's really just careless. It's also just making sure that evenly within the team, you promote meritocracy, that everybody shows up, because what often also happens, and that we don't talk about enough, is the unintended consequences of not dealing people who are not performing. All it does, it spills over on other team members, and part of the harmony within the team is also, something that contributes towards a state of mental health, within the business. So for me, those are two things that I think leaders have. It's actually non-negotiable. That is your responsibility, over and above, human capital coming in and saying, have we actually designed our structure and the jobs in a manner that is fair, that enables people to deliver without feeling like they have to be, working for 23 hours a day constantly, because that's also not sustainable, And I think for me, it's key. Leaders need to push back. You're in a role because you have the authority to negotiate. We can't expect our teams to constantly be pushing up. There's positional hierarchy that impacts relationships in the work. And so, I think for me, that's really the part of the higher calling, of leaders and the responsibility that we have.
Yeah. I think something which I think you're talking about is, how do your leaders talk about you when you're not in the room, right? Are they your biggest defenders? Are they your biggest advocates? Are they, telling your story and singing your praises? Because that's ultimately what you want from your leader.
Yeah.
To touch on another point that you've mentioned is this balancing act again between being empathetic as a leader, but also driving accountability. And, it's easier to shy away from difficult conversations. But again, as a leader, part of what your responsibility is to drive accountability. So how do you get that balance right?
A famous person, once said, a lot of conflict, is resulting from the tone, or how the message has been delivered. And it is possible to have a high-performance team, to drive a high-performance culture along and hold people accountable while coming across as a caring, leader. Because it boils down to, how are you communicating, the message? Nobody wants to feel humiliated. Nobody wants to feel disrespected or embarrassed. And I think the art of it is really just, how do you deliver the message around what is expected versus the shortcoming or what you are experiencing from the individual, but done respectfully and not in a manner, that results in people feeling humiliated. And that is how you can actually stick to, the facts, which is expectations not being met. And I think that's where it really sits, there's often such this misnomer that you somehow have to be hard and brash, for people to actually be clear on what the goals is or what needs to be done, or for you to hold a high performance culture. And that's not true. I'm here today to say it is a complete untruth. It's a fallacy that exists. And I think really it's a shortcut in judgment, of people who are not prepared to sit and say, Alon, out of the 5 things I expected, 3 were done really well, but these 2, really it didn't meet the expectations because of 1, 2, 3. And there is nothing nasty about having such a conversation, so the balance is there. I just think it takes practice, and the more you do it, the easier it gets. And being mindful of subtle things, so do you really want to give somebody feedback that's not pleasant, in a room full of other people? No. Would you want to be treated the same, If it's a difficult conversation and you're worried about having a neutral space, maybe then don't have it in the office, or go to the canteen, or go across where there's still privacy, but the individual feels that they're being respected. It really all boils down to the how, but you can have both.
Yeah. So I want to get back to the how, because I think it's often overlooked and common theme across what we're discussing here. But before we do, I mean, you've touched on objective expectations around what's expected, ensuring that you provide feedback respectfully.
Yeah.
But I think both of those things, like, so easy when you hear them, but so often overlooked by managers, right? People are not respectful when they give feedback. And I think often when you see performance issues, it's because people don't actually know what's expected of them. So how do you ensure that you create that discipline within an organization around what, KPIs are and how people are going to be held accountable and how those conversations happen? Is there a process that you follow to ensure that that's done consistently, especially, across those large organizations that you work with?
Some of the mechanisms that have worked well, across the different companies I've had the privilege of serving, it's, at times perhaps separating, the conversation. So there's one conversation about what are the ambitions of the organization and what aspects of those are directly influenced by what we do. So having a clear discussion with your employees, teams around that's important because it makes the link for them, And then secondly, the tasks that are then broken down into the delivery, of that piece. And that has to be a consistent, regular conversation, Alon. Now, different companies have different performance management philosophies. Whether you officially communicate a performance rating scale mid-year or at the end of the year, that doesn't matter. What you want is to remove the element of surprise. People must know where they stand, every quarter or every month, insofar as their agreed deliverables are concerned. But making the link is key. Otherwise, people don't know what they're doing, And secondly, they can really underestimate the impact of not delivering, against what is a task because it contributes to the bigger scheme, for the goal. The other conversation then is the K one around Palesa as a person. How are things going? What's happening at home? As much as the person is willing to share, what are the things you're struggling with? What are the, how do you want me to show up? What are your developmental goals? Because that for me, makes you show up as a wholesome leader who, yes, we talk about work, we talk about what needs to be done, how far are we from the objectives we set for ourselves, but at the same time, there's enough time for you to talk about me and to hear from me what I want to say. And I think from a how perspective, it matters to give the person the mic. Let them talk to you about how they're progressing. It's a small but such an impactful action, Alon. I think as leaders, we get into a space where we think we're being paid to talk a lot more than listen. And there's power in listening. When you give somebody the opportunity to tell you how they think they've performed or how the month has progressed, it really changes their accountability. So it's no longer also just you being experienced as somebody with a stick approach, because you're actually listening. And yours is to say, where do I then come in to coach? And to also know whether the person is actually looking for advice or if they need help. If you allow them to speak and own their goals so that they give you feedback on where they're at and where they think they're struggling or what the prospects of delivering on time, are, that's really powerful. Listening is a skill.
Again, I think so obvious, but so, yeah, I think you summed it up perfectly. Leaders come in and they think they need to have the answers and tell everyone everything, but what they actually need to do is just pause and listen.
Correct.
It's so powerful. I think another point that you made is just this ability to do things which sound like they are at a conflict to one another, but they're actually not. You can still drive that accountability, but be empathetic. You can still understand and show respect, but ensure that when difficult conversations need to happen, they are happening. And I think the other point is just this point around nothing should become a surprise when it's time for that performance management conversation. So it goes back to your point around communication, that if you are communicating regularly, by the time that you're having that conversation, what I've said to the team is if you're having a conversation with your manager and they're telling you that your performance is not where it needs to be, and it's the first time that you're sharing it, that's problematic, right? Because where's that communication gap been?
Correct.
If you're doing it twice a year, officially, what have you been speaking about? Because it's too late, actually, at that point to have that conversation for the first time.
That's right.
Something else that I want to touch on, and I think you've spoken about it, but is there's two things that leaders can do that people within an organization can do. I don't think it's just about leaders. It's the what they do, and it's the how they do it. And the what, to some of the points that you've made, is often quite objective and a lot easier to measure and, objectively say this person has or hasn't met their KPIs. But the how is sometimes more complex.
Yeah.
So how do you measure the how? How do you know if there are people within the organization that are driving positive culture, that there are leaders that are being empathetic? How do you measure that? And importantly, have it as part of your performance review, because we shouldn't just be rewarding, I think in a previous life I was with Uber, I think they called it brilliant jerks, right? You don't want that, right? You want people who are top performers but are also kind and respectful. So how do you measure the how?
Sure. So, there are systems in place, right? So a lot of organizations over time will use stakeholder feedback, 360, a lot of companies call it 360-degree feedback, because what it does is it's encouraging people to seek feedback, from different people that they deal with, not just from the top, from peers, from even, people that may be from a hierarchy perspective below them. But let me tell you, Alon, nothing beats how they call it the smell of the place. When you walk into a department, the energy, the sentiments, how people are showing up will tell you the health state, how people are engaging with one another, what words are being used, how do we talk to one another. And that, for me, is probably the single ingredient I use to assess, what the state of affairs is here from a culture perspective. It's easy to measure, by kind of sending out surveys. But the reality is, people by default will go to somebody who has good things to say about them, and not necessarily people who have more developmental feedback. So I think it's in the engagements, how do people relate to one another? Is there conflict here? And conflict is not a bad thing, but is it being managed constructively? So i.e. we can challenge each other, but while respecting one another, it's free for us to share differing views actually and be comfortable with seeing the same problem from two different perspectives, because we appreciate that we have different, diverse lenses that we bring to the table. Or is it a sense that there's one person actually here who talks and it's the leader, and everybody else must just, be quiet and do their work? And it's intangible. So that's why it's tricky. It's tricky because it's intangible. So while you have systems that can measure, the reality is it's what do you experience when you walk around in the team? Or is it different when the leader's not there? And really icy cold when the leader's there? Because that tells you something, it's a data point. And it's so critical for us to be tuned into that, There are other things that you can obviously look at. I'm very passionate about using data to inform or kind of, know how do we want to respond. And there's a clear correlation between, where the leadership style doesn't work for the team and the attrition, as an example, or the lack of diversity in the team. So if everybody looks like little Alon, then there's a problem there. And everybody who doesn't look like Alon doesn't stay long, right? That's a data point over and above everything else, because it's easy to have I call it a lottery of friends, in any systems that's in place. But often when you know that the team is really running, in the same pace and the same tone, and the values are really anchored into how the team operates, you feel it, and you feel it by walking around. So important right now in this era of, everybody trying to figure out what their hybrid way of working is, for leaders to be present and visible, walk the floor, on the Wednesday, if you're in the office on the Wednesday, be visible, be present, get a sense of what is the ambiance, is everybody seemingly still getting along? Are the systems in place for people to really reconnect so that you can get a field and a pulse, on how people are showing up and how conducive the environment is in them actually teaming, and working naturally as colleagues. That for me is how you get a sense of whether things are working here or not.
So it's really, I think, especially as a human capital exec in the business, your role to have your finger on the pulse of the organization, what's not being said, creating safe spaces so nothing's left unsaid either. I think just in closing, I've loved the conversation. I think there's so much, but because it's so powerful, I know you refer to yourself as the chief dealer of hope.
Yeah.
So what would be your tip for, they don't have to be leaders, but people within organizations that are wanting to inspire others with hope? What's something that's worked for you? What's something that you think others can emulate?
Yeah, I think we all have a personal responsibility, Alon, to show up as, in a way that inspires others to do the same. So, being positive, showing up with care, is a decision that we can all make, actually. I know everybody is battling, different, personal issues that sometimes nobody knows about. But showing up to contribute positively is a decision that anybody can make, regardless of the circumstances. And all of us actually are leaders, There are positional titles and hierarchies because an organization is designed a certain way. But there's nothing stopping a junior business partner in my team for standing up and showing up as a leader and calling out people who aren't. And I think it's for people to exercise their agency, and be that energy that you want to receive, really, and I really don't mean to sound, as if I'm trying to kind of remix what Mahatma Gandhi said, but it really is about that. Don't be the person who brings juju in the office. And, juju is a slang used in West Africa for just bad vibes, bad energy. So bring what you expect to get, because the building without the people is actually just a building. But the moment there are people in the building, you get the sense and the energy, and we all contribute to that. And that's really my parting thought. We all bring in the energy that we want to receive, and we must do that respectfully, responsibly, and with good intention. And that's how we all become chief dealers of hope.
That's a mindset. It's about bringing that positivity. I love it. Well, thanks so much. Really love the conversation. Thanks so much to everyone for joining us. I think we learned so much here from Palesa around, empathetic leadership, around the balancing act that leaders need to get right when sometimes it's difficult conversations, but having those conversations as people in an authentic manner, in a respectful manner. And importantly, I think if you take nothing else away, let's bring hope, let's bring positivity. We know we all need more of that, right? The world needs more of that now. So thanks so much, and look forward to chatting again.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.